Welcome to our special bonus episode of Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Robert Perry. And today we are joined by two very special guests. We have with us Sue Pearson, our Emmy Award-winning story project manager, and we are also thrilled to have James Gregory with us. James has been with the Circle for many, many years. Robert and James have been friends since the early 90s, I believe. And James is
80s.
overseeing 80s. Oh, wow. Okay, even further. And James is overseeing a very special category of stories in our story project that we'll talk to you about in just a moment. I should also mention that James is also married to our very own longtime teacher, Marianne Bachowski, here at the Circle. So many of you may be familiar with James already. But I want to zoom out first and say a bit more about what the Circle's story project is. Here at the Circle, it has long been a dream of ours, particularly of Robert's, to be a home for a collection of stories of personal experience with the principles of the Course. So stories of inner transformations that are inspired by the Course, stories of holy instance, story of guidance, and so on. And these stories are meant to help the teachings of the Course come alive and demonstrate the truth in the teachings. And we've always wanted to have a storehouse for these stories on our website, which we do now at circleofa.org/story-project. You can also find it if you visit circleofa.org under the resources tab. There's a link to the story project there. So Robert, before we get to Sue and James, I wanted to just ask you, as the keeper of the flame of the story project for a long time, why is it that you wanted to have a story project on the Circle site, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, well, we collected stories here and there over a lot of years. In fact, on the old website, we used to have a student experiences section. Didn't have very many on there, but we had it. I think in either our very first newsletter or one of our very first newsletters back in the early 90s, we had a story of a man I know in St. Louis who had a profound holy instant. It's one of the favorite pieces that we did, of mine at least, one of my favorites in the early years. We also, in the early years of the newsletter, had a story of a course student who was a teacher in Portland who had a healing of terminal breast cancer through using the principles of the Course. And so there's always been this desire to have a collection of stories. We just have never been that like conscious and concerted about really doing it right. About 10 years ago, we collected some other stories, another miraculous healing of cancer. I think the general idea is that we've always had a strong conviction that the Course is meant to be a lived path, a path that has, truly significant transformative results in one's life. And as that lived path, it's clear that the Course expects all kinds of diverse things to happen if we're really applying the principles. You mentioned receiving guidance. There's some great stories of guidance out there. We have one now from Sue, which is incredible. There are people having profound spiritual experiences, holy instance. There are people joining together in holy relationships or having holy encounters. There are people expressing love, and the Course calls miracles expressions of love. So people extending miracles. And the list really could go on. The Course expects there to be spiritual healings of physical illness. Obviously, inner shifts where something had been a source of fear or grief or whatever, and that falling away and being replaced by peace and joy. So I don't want to try to give an exhaustive list because it would be long, but the point is that if we're doing this path, we're supposed to be having these principles show up in concrete experience in our lives. And then when people hear the stories of that, obviously it is it gives the sense that this is real,
Mm.
and this can give me the kind of benefits I want. And so it can help us get started on this path, or it can give us encouragement for keeping going.
Yeah, there's so many benefits to the stories in the story project. It can make you feel like you're less alone on your journey with the course. And one thing that I've found really helpful about it is, as a course teacher, when I'm looking for stories to augment a class or a Sunday gathering, I will go into the story project on the Circle site and type in the topic that I'm writing about,
Mm,
and a story will pop up, and then I'm able to give an example, you share a story in the sermon or whatever that is course based. And so that's a really helpful aspect of the story project as well. So I want to come to you now. You are the lead of the story project, and we're so grateful to have you. The story project started, was it 2 years ago? Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, around about 2 years ago. How did you, the Circle has this way of, whenever Robert and I are thinking we really, really need to get this done, and we start to like pour energy into the intention, people show up, and you did. And so I just love to hear more from you about why this is an important project to you.
Well, from the course, we know there's one mind. And this is such a great example of that, because you and Robert were thinking, oh, how could we put a story project together, and who would do it, and blah, blah, blah. Well, I just happened at the same time to read a story that Robert posted in was it Course Companions or the newsletter? Anyway, it was on the Circle's website, and I read it. It was one of those wonderful personal stories that exemplifies course principles. And at the very end of the story, Robert kind of came back with a PS at the bottom and said, if you have stories that you would like to share, please be in touch with us here at the Circle of Atonement. And I just sat there and went, oh, this is what I've been looking for. Because for many years, I had been writing my own personal stories, and many of them I didn't know had course principles involved, because they happened before I was introduced to the course, but they all did. And so I thought, oh, this is my chance to share a story. And would I love to write other people's stories as well? Because I've been a writer for 40 plus years in my chosen career as a broadcast journalist. And when that was over, I didn't want to just, sit on the porch in a rocking chair. I wanted to continue to write. And so this seemed like a great opportunity to me. And so I wrote to Robert and Emily and said, I have a story that I would love to share with you. And in fact, I have many other stories I'd like to share, but let me start with this one. And I believe the first one I sent was titled, You Don't Have to Die to Get to Heaven. It's kind of, in a way, my foundational story, because it changed my life when I lived this experience. And that's the one I sent to you all, and you saw it and said, oh, this could work for our story project. And the story was about my own, it wasn't exactly a near-death experience, although some people call it a shared death experience. But it was extraordinary. And my deceased mother helped my father pass over when it was his time to transition. And just miraculously, I was allowed to be on part of that journey. So I saw so much. And when I say see, I didn't see with these eyes, but I can describe the scene to you. And of course, I wrote it in great detail in the story. But I was able to discern so many things that were true. And the Course talks about that
Mhm.
God is our creator, that God is love, that God is all, that my mother was pure and innocent. And in my lifetime with her, it didn't seem that way. We had a very difficult relationship. But in a nanosecond, not even time, I forgave her completely because I could see how glorious and how holy she was.
Mm.
So that was the first one that I sent to you. And there followed many more of my own. And what I see from the people who send in stories to me to edit is that these stories are so reassuring, confirming. So if you read about somebody else's experience, you in many cases you can go, oh, something very similar happened to me.
Mhm.
And it just makes the Course come alive for you and reassures you that what you're reading in this incredible book is the truth.
Mhm.
And I had not come to the Course before I had my shared death experience. But when I came to the Course, I started reading and I just went, oh, this is what I learned in my shared death experience. So it has to be the truth. And of course, there was so much more that Jesus imparted to those of us who study the Course. But um, we had another person, Deborah Kaiser, share a near-death experience with us on the Story Project. And it is just a superbly beautiful story. I
Yeah.
hope anybody watching can.
And that's really the inspiration for your original email to Robert and I, Sue, was in response to an article that he had written about the Course's version of vision. The Course has a
Oh,
very
right.
particular
Yes.
definition of what vision
Yeah.
is. And as he described what vision is in the Course, at the end, he put out a call for stories. And what you were surprised to discover, Robert, was that people poured in with their stories about this experience of vision where you only see the love, only loving thoughts are true, and everything else drops away. And so this was a very common course-based experience, but there wasn't language for it.
Hmm.
If
Hmm.
you look at Thomas Merton's infamous Louisville experience that so many know about, that is an experience of what the Course calls vision, but there is no language for it. Like no one calls Thomas Merton's Louisville experience vision unless you're a Course student. So we're having these different experiences and the Course gives us a container for them. So you were responding to Robert's call for stories, Sue, not even realizing Robert had written that article like
Years
12 years
earlier.
ago or
It was
Yeah.
the whole
something.
piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's
Another thing I want to share about your experience, Sue, and I don't know if you recall this or not, but several months before you reached out and said that you'd be, willing to help pull stories together, um, your shared death experience got published by the International Association of Near-Death Studies.
yes.
And there was a buzz on the Circle's Facebook page, and people were saying, you've got to read this story. And I went and read it, and I thought, oh my God, there is like course principle after course principle. And I don't get the sense that this woman necessarily knows about the Course, but the principles are in there. And then after everyone was buzzing about it on the Facebook page, Bill, your husband, came on and said, well, this is my wife, and she is a Course student now.
Thank you for reminding me. I had forgotten about that piece of it. And it's so sweet. It's so
Yeah.
lovely how
Yeah.
these things come together the way they do. I want to emphasize, though, for anybody who's got a story to tell, it doesn't have to be a near-death experience. Those are pretty dramatic. It can be, something less miraculous and amazing, but still exemplifies Course principles. And we have lots of those.
Mhm.
So Robert, you and I do love the near-death stories, though.
Yeah, they're very powerful.
They are
Yeah.
indeed. And this is the other point I wanted to make, was that putting the story together to me was creating a safe place for people to tell about experiences that they might not have been courageous enough to tell the world about. It wasn't in my case, because I was ready to tell the story to anybody who would listen. But some people are reluctant. They're afraid about being judged, and wonder if somebody will say, oh, there's another crazy person. This is not the case. We know it's not the case. But that's why the Story Project has become such a safe haven for people who have extraordinary and sometimes simple spiritual experiences.
I love that you say that too, about this is a safe space, because so often in the spiritual community, we feel like we don't want to share these stories because we're afraid of being judged because of them. And so we keep them to ourselves. And then we rob the world of the story, but we also rob other people of the opportunity to say, hey, that happened to me too. And the more we can look at each other and say, hey, that happened to me too, then the more we have a different kind of world, because then spirituality doesn't seem like this fringe woo-woo thing. It's just the foundation. There is a truer truth going on here. And if we can all kind of look at each other and realize that,
Yeah.
then it will be a different world where we're run by different principles. But that only happens if we're freed to tell our stories and not keep them
Absolutely.
locked up.
Emily, there is something that is scary about being vulnerable, telling your heartfelt, intimate, deepest spiritual stories. But I have found that when I do, when I step out there in all my vulnerability and just let it all show, the rewards are just tremendous, because you inspire people, you motivate people.
You
Uh,
move them.
yes,
Yeah.
and that's part of what we're trying to do with the Story Project, is to touch people's lives with all these incredible course principles that have been at work for all of us.
Mm.
So that's the beginning. And
Well,
now we're just chugging along.
Sue, if someone's listening and they are interested in submitting a story, can you talk a little bit about what it is that you're looking for and where they would go to share their story with you?
Sure. Well, if you're curious about it, and I hope whoever's listening or watching is, will go to the circleofa.org website. And you can do a drop down menu from resources, which is the header, and down the list you'll find the Story Project. Click on that, and up will come an introduction, who we are, what we're trying to do, and a submission guidelines, a form that you can fill out to say, I'd like to submit a story. And also you can then go and read some stories. And I would highly recommend that if you've got one to tell. Read some stories in different categories. You'll get kind of a feel for what we're looking for. We're not looking for essays, which would be just somebody talking about a lesson they learned, but not telling us about the experience they had. We're looking for experiences that you've had. We don't want blogs. Not to say your blog isn't wonderful, but for the Story Project, we're just looking for these wonderful, alive experiences, putting course principles into practice. They can be short. We like short. I'm saying something like 500 words would be short, or even shorter. And we can go up to 2,000 words. But that's kind of our upper limit, although it's not, it's not a rock solid guideline. We can go either way. You should know that James and I both are editors of our particular story, the stories that come to us. And so we'll take each individual story. Sometimes they need very little editing. Sometimes they need a lot of editing. And I don't want people to be afraid of that process. And so far, my experience has been that people are grateful for an editor's hand on a story, because if you're a good editor, and I know James is, you can make a story shine by kind of cutting away the pieces that reveal the diamond, so to speak. And whenever I've had to do a really big edit job, with a little trepidation, I contact the author and say, as gently as I can, your story needed some editing, and I'm sending you the copy so that you can take a look at it. If there's anything to change, change it. If you don't like it, let me know. We're not publishing stories without the author's approval. And in every single case, people have been so gracious. Thank you for making my story that much better. So I want to thank them for their open-mindedness, and don't be afraid to send a story that's not perfect.
Yeah.
James and I will make it shine.
Well, before we get to James, and we're looking forward to talking to you as well, James, you have your own fantastic stories to tell from your own life. A lot of us have been following your path on Facebook. James has been sharing stories from his own life. You're a wonderful writer, James, and we are blessed to have you working with us here in the Story Project. But before we get to James, Sue, because this is the Story Project, we thought that it would be fun to have you read one of your favorite stories from the archives that we have online. So what would you like to share with us?
I would like to read Sue Lindsay's story titled Joy. Sue has sent us multiple stories, and I contacted her and asked her, do you mind if I read this story online? And she said, oh, that would be wonderful. So here we go. Even though it was expected, when the call from my brother came early in the morning of January 2nd, I felt like I had received a punch to my stomach. Our mother of 96 years was gone from us. No more visits to Nana, no more laughter, no more memories shared. It was all gone. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I went downstairs. It was still dark, and that made me feel even more lonely. My husband had gone back to bed at my request. It was an odd feeling. I wanted to share my grief, yet I also wanted to be alone. After the sun had been in the sky for an hour or so, I decided it was time to call our two grown sons. I first called our younger son, Doug. We acknowledged our sadness, and then he told me that since Nana had been in failing health for a while, he had been preparing himself for this call. We shared some remembrances and talked a little about funeral arrangements. When I called Mike, I was in for a surprise. Mike had an especially close relationship with his Nana. He called her almost every week and shared his life and love with her in a special way. When he answered the phone, he told me he knew why I was calling. He said that Nana had come to him in the night, that he woke up about the time of her passing and sensed a presence in the room. He said that he knew it was her and that she was happy, joyful, and wanted all to know this. I was shocked. This coming from my common sense, rational, no nonsense, and skeptical son was amazing. The fact that I had also had otherworldly experiences only confirmed to me that what he had told me was true. Practical matters lay ahead, yet miracles were also happening. As I packed and prepared to travel the 5 hours for the family gathering and funeral, I became increasingly aware that my level of joy was increasing. I packed effortlessly. I gave no thought to the decisions made. It was as though decisions were being made on a higher level. As I was traveling and got closer to my destination, my joy increased so that my very being felt light and spacious. Nothing bothered me. I was being carried on a cloud. The day of the funeral arrived. I felt a sense of reunion with the people assembled there. Some in attendance had been the focus of humor in our family for their quirkiness, oddness, or particular way of being. In my elevated state that day, all I knew was radiance, love, and truth. All that existed was the present moment. My mind was fixed, unable to go into the past or the future because truth existed only in the now. This was not intellectual truth, but rather truth of being, truth of life, eternal life, truth that God is all and that the source of all is ever surrounding, unfolding, and expressing itself in every present moment. My joy was present throughout the service. Although those in attendance remained the same in human appearance, a shared heavenly love had united us all in a way that no earthly experience could do. I loved everyone with intense love, and they seemed to love me in the same way. As I write this now, I realize that it is impossible to describe this in any meaningful manner with just words. We were all love, made of love, and living love, a love beyond description, a living, breathing, palpable love that infused everyone and everything. After the luncheon that followed the service, people gathered in the room where the casket was placed. I became aware that the body in the casket held no meaning for me. I had no attachment to it at all. In fact, none of the bodies around me seemed real. I saw the people, but I knew their bodies held no significance. I sat down next to my sister and every once in a while looked over at the casket. I started to giggle to myself. The laughter arose within me, but was not a laughter of the commonplace. This laughter had a joy of the everlasting. More and more, I became aware of the total insanity of the whole scene. The laughter of the absurd came upon me. The truth was all around. I knew it, I felt it, I lived it. Life is life, and death is but a bad joke that has lost its humor. Life is joy, love, union, and always in the ever-present now. The funeral truly seemed like a scene from a movie, everyone playing a part, a role, unaware what was truly going on. For some reason, I had been given the script, the screenplay, and could see that it was nothing more than that. Not real, just a play, a movie. And just like people die in movies, they die in this movie too. How I wish I could reach back and grab that awareness, hold on to it, and live in that state constantly. My sense of being carried on a cloud remained with me for several days, but then slowly faded. My normal awareness has returned, but never without the memory of when truth made its home in me.
Mm.
Ah.
A great
What a
story.
great experience.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Sue.
Thank you. It's an honor to be able to present these to people.
Well, we have a new category in our story project, and this category is called From Church to Course. And this new category is reflective of a new direction with the circle. Would you say, Robert?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So do you want to talk more about the ways in which we're using the story project to reach what we're calling the post-church crowd?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a confluence of something that we've been thinking, and then James approached us with this idea, and the two slotted right into place with each other. So we've become increasingly aware of a couple of things. One is that people are streaming out of the Christian church in the Western world. In the US, a lot of it is because people are turned off by the evangelical church and where it's gone in recent years. And a lot of it is just that they feel either unsatisfied spiritually, or they feel actually wounded by various doctrines and attitudes. And so these people are leaving the church on a spiritual search. And lo and behold, the course seems almost written to that crowd. It was not written to a more New Age crowd, for instance. It was written full of Christian language, full of a certain rootedness in basic Christian principles and worldview, and yet also in disagreement with so much that has been in the Christian tradition. And yet those things that seems to differ with are the very things that people are feeling wounded by. And so the course seems to contain the healing and the sustenance that crowd's been looking for. And I think also, just to add on, we've become increasingly aware that when we get people coming to the circle and coming to the course after a lot of years in the sort of alternative spiritual scene, very often the values in that scene make them not so well suited to really like hunker down in the course, because there's a lot of really kind of like me first attitudes out there, and we're always trying to unwind that. Mm-hmm. And so we're thinking, and maybe that the people who come out of the church may have a set of attitudes that perhaps are more congenial to the course. So we've been behind the scenes talking about and getting ready for a whole push out into reaching those people who often are wandered and feeling a bit lost, and hopefully they can find a home in the course, and maybe the course was designed for them to do that. And while we were thinking that, we heard from James.
As happens, because that's how Sue came along. As we were thinking, well, let's get this story project going, and lo and behold, here's Sue. And then we're thinking, okay, how can we break the course out into this audience of people who are streaming out of the church, but still retain a connection with God, Jesus, scripture, and community? And how can the course touch them? And then lo and behold, here comes James with an interest in this very thing. So James, do you want to say a few words, or would you say a few words rather, about your connection with this idea of going from church to course?
Sure. Well, I'm one of those people that Robert was talking about. I was raised Catholic, but as I became an adult, I drifted away from the religion of my parents because it no longer seemed relevant to me. It was too rigid, too many rules, too much emphasis on sin. And then I entered into my seeking period of life. I'd retained a love of Jesus, and I read the Bible regularly. But there was a hole in my life, an unfulfilled longing. And what I was looking for was a spiritual path that answered questions like, who am I and why am I here? Questions that weren't answered by the Catholic faith. And so for years, I traveled the world. I looked into Eastern philosophies. I looked into New Age teachings, even in evangelical Christianity with all the hand waving. And from each of them, I took something of value, but none really represented to me what I felt was the whole truth. None represented to me what I felt was a true fit. And then I found the course, and that's another story, which I'll tell at a later time. But what I do remember is that I fought it at first. The ideas seemed so radical from anything that I had come across before. But I stuck with it. The fact that my wife as a course teacher kind of gave me a bit of incentive. The fact that the Circle of Atonement hired me to manage their office was an incentive to learn something about the course. They took a bit of a risk on me in that regard. But as I looked deeper into the course, I heard the voice of Jesus speaking. And as I learned more about the teachings, I realized they answered all my questions. And I found what I was looking for. I was home, and what a relief. It was a relief because I wasn't a seeker anymore. And that was such a blessing. So a few years later, Robert mentioned he and I have known each other for a long time before. I think you were even a course student or a course teacher back to the 80s. But in the 2000s, around 2004, I remember very clearly about having a talk with Robert. Now that I'd found the course and that I really felt my true path, I wanted to share this, especially with other Christians that might have been that were similar to me on the path, but hadn't found what I was looking for. And I had all these great plans. I was telling Robert I wanted to write this, and I wanted to give a full history of the Bible, and I wanted to write all about the course. And Robert, in his wisdom, said, I remember so clearly, tell what you're best at. Tell the James story. And it felt like a bit of a put down, but I've held that in my heart ever since. And I tried a few other things, nothing worked. And so fast forward many, many years to earlier this year. And I've got not only this desire to share my story, but in the meantime, I'd met a lot of other course students who had very similar stories. And so when Robert and Emily and I sat down and had this talk about what to do with this, as Robert said, it seemed like a good fit with what the circle was already planning to do. And they already had the story project up and running. And Robert suggested, well, that maybe we can create a new category, something like from church to course. And James, you can be the one who collects the stories and edits them. How does that sound? And that sounded great to me.
And there's so many students out there, potential course students, again, those who have left the church, but they're searching. They've left the church, but they still retain that connection to God and Jesus, and yet they're looking for a path that they can call home. And so our hope is that those students will come across the stories in the Circle Story Project and find in the course teachings that very thing that they're looking for, much like what you've done yourself, James. And so I know that you hold that intention with us to find students who connect with the course from a Christian background or Judaism, anything. Robert, I know you had mentioned just a minute ago about there's something like within the course that speaks to the Christian in particular. There's a lot of Christian language in the course. And so when students come into the course from New Age, for example, we find that we're doing a lot of unwinding that we don't have to do when they come from the Christian church, for example. So when you say to someone who came from church, God is the greater one, they're like, okay, yeah, I get that. And when you have a student who's come from the New Age community and you say God is the greater one, the answer tends to be, well, no, we're all God. And so there's a certain mentality among what we're calling post-Christians, where you don't have to do a lot of the unwinding that you have to do in some other circles. And so the course is a natural fit for students who have left the church, who are looking for a new spiritual home. So along that line, James, we've asked you to select a story from your church to course category. And so you're going to share one with us from a course student named Mary Lucero. So please.
And just really quickly, we had a story from Mary on the old site in the student experiences category. We probably should pull that out of the files and post it on the story. It was a really good story.
Mary tells a good story, to be sure, and I'm grateful that she's also a personal friend. So this is Mary's story in her own words. She's entitled it "I See Clearly Now," and it's interesting. This category that it's going into, it's a brand new story. It hasn't even been put into the story project yet. The category, as you know, is called "From Church to Course." You could subtitle this story "From Church to Church to Church to Course," and you'll see why as we go through her story. Mary says, "All my life, I have had a hunger to know God. When I was 8 years old, I remember looking up into the sky and feeling homesick for heaven. And although I was baptized Catholic, my family did not go to church. One Sunday, I asked my mother if I could go to Mass with our neighbor, and she agreed. And the first time I entered the church, I felt like I was coming home. I attended Mass faithfully, made my first Holy Communion and confirmation, and eventually I talked my brother and sister into joining me every Sunday. Oh, how I loved God so much that on Saturdays when I went to confession, I'd make up sins so that I could receive more penance. My misguided thinking was that God would be pleased if I prayed more Hail Marys and Lord's prayers. And yet, no matter how hard I tried, I never felt good enough to truly please God. I was afraid of going to hell. After years with the Catholic Church, I started to go to a Protestant church and read the Bible fervently. I attended and led Bible studies, sang in choirs. Still, I felt I wasn't good enough, and if the rapture took place, I would be left behind. Decades later, the pastor of my church told me that my rebellious daughter was going to hell unless I prayed harder for her. I was furious. I told him, I have calluses on my knees from praying so hard for my daughter, and if I had to, I would die on a cross so she could be saved. And I know that God loves her even more than I do. And at that moment, I realized God loved me as much as he loved my daughter, and never again did I doubt where I would go when I died: heaven. A few years later, I filed for divorce from my husband of 28 years. My church said I did not have biblical grounds for divorce because he had not committed adultery nor physically abused me. I pointed out that this so-called other woman was alcohol, and his addiction was so severe, our children and I were subjected to a form of mental abuse. He refused to go to counseling or rehab, and I felt I had no alternative but to leave him because our 3 daughters and I did not need this chaos in our lives. And the church that had been supportive of my family, that had been my supportive family and community, asked me to step down from all my responsibilities, and it turned its back on me. After 30 years of faithful service, I had no choice but to leave. My heart was broken. I found solace by going to the chapel in the hospital close to our house, where I could be alone and cry out to God for direction. One day, my middle daughter invited me to a local Unity church where her favorite speaker was going to preach, and I enjoyed it so much, I became a regular. And then I learned a Course in Miracles group was meeting in the church each week, and I was curious and went to a meeting to check it out. Unfortunately, at that meeting, they were going through the psychotherapy pamphlet, and the material was way over my head, and I was totally confused. To make matters worse, a lot of people were sharing personal problems, and I felt uncomfortable, and I never returned. However, a seed had been planted, and I bought the course. Not long after that experience, I felt the need to get away for a week or so. And for some reason, I'd always wanted to visit Sedona, Arizona, although I did not know a soul there. A friend at Unity Church told me about a guest house called Course Community House that was dedicated to the course and rented rooms to visitors. I booked a room, flew to Sedona, and I brought with me that course book that I'd never opened. It turned out to be the vacation of a lifetime. Each day, teachers from the Circle of Atonement would drop by to teach the text and the workbook. They showed us the proper way to study the course. At my first meeting, I asked, who wrote this book? The teacher told me that Jesus was the author and Helen Schuckman was the scribe. I was skeptical, but as soon as I started reading from the course, I knew without a doubt that this was from Jesus, the same Jesus I have known and loved since childhood and my church days. I was amazed. And here are some of the things that Jesus of the course taught me that week. That I was created in God's image, not an ego image of my own making. That I am divine and magnificent, and that judgment, guilt, and shame are not part of who I am. That I am love, and I'm here to see love in nothing else, that I am love, and I am here to see love and nothing else in myself and others, and that I am one in God and with all my brothers and sisters. By the end of that week, I had come to love the Course. It taught me that I am an effect of the Father, and that can never change. I felt totally secure. I now consider myself a Course student and a Christian. I look back at what brought me to this point, and I'm grateful for every experience because I realized that the challenges were just opportunities to see things differently. I still love and read the Bible, but with a different perception. There are so many beautiful scriptural references in the Course, shared in a way that Jesus meant for us to understand them. I'm filled with a clarity concerning the scripture passages that I'd once found confusing. And although I don't talk about the Course with my Christian family, I ask the Holy Spirit to provide me opportunities to share with them Course principles and the Course's take on the scriptures using their Christian language in a way that extends love. There's such a need for Christians to feel non-judged, eternally secure, and that they are magnificent holy sons and daughters of God. Jesus of the Course came to fulfill the law of love, telling us that nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. I smile when I think that there was a time in my life when I couldn't even look at a book like the Course, for now I totally embrace it. Every day it reminds me that only love is real. And seeing my second husband and my daughters with the eyes of Christ has made a huge change in them and in me. For when I see them with love, I receive it back tenfold.
Beautiful story from Mary. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, James.
Great story.
Yeah. And that is the category from Church to Course that has received quite a few submissions. You're sitting on a pile of about 10 stories to get on the website, right, James?
And more, hopefully, from this podcast will be coming in.
Yeah, for sure. So if you're out there and you're listening and you're thinking, I have a story of a Course principle that I could share, or I found the Course from being in a church community, then please go to the Circle Story Project, again, circleofa.org/story-project, and share it with us. We would absolutely love to hear from you. We have quite a collection of stories now, and the next phase of the Story Project is we're starting to put some of the stories to video. So we have 3 videos out now. Well, we have, let's see, one coming out soon called The Vision That Changed My Life. The stories, the videos of the stories are getting more and more, they're getting better and better. They're getting more and more professional. So we're very proud of them, and we're hoping that those videos reach far and wide to bring new attention and new authors and new stories to the Circle Story Project.
I want to add that I think that if people get a chance to see the 2 videos that are out there, one is Sue's, a story of Sue's, called My Brother's Family, and the other is from one of our students here at the Circle, Derek. What does he call it? The
late
deposit. Yeah, and they're both great stories, and one really nice thing about them is they're very down to earth. You know, we have the whole spectrum out there in the Story Project. We have some very profound spiritual experiences, but also some just down to earth things that exemplify Course principles of love and forgiveness and looking beyond people's outer appearance and so on.
Can I just add too that many times people discount the extraordinary things that happen to them, especially miraculous things. And I hope that in reading some of these stories, the down to earth ones especially, that people can see, oh, that's what a miracle is. Maybe I should pay more attention to those moments, those little moments of love and light and shift.
Yeah, and sometimes that's all it takes is to read a story about something that happened to someone and say, hey, that happened to me, or I'm inspired by that, to do a little bit better, to show a little bit more love. And actually, speaking of changing lives, we have had an example of that in the story project. I'm thinking in particular of Deb Kaiser, who submitted a story. I think maybe we referenced this earlier, submitted a story to the story project. Robert had been trying to get her to do it for years. And because of the story project, she finally put this together, this experience of a NDE she had
Well, I
had when
think
she was very
I
young.
emailed her and said, hey, are you ready? Kind of at last. And
Uh-huh.
she showed me, she had put a sticker on her, posted on her computer that said, write the story for Robert.
Yeah,
The same
I
day.
know. It's so weird how all of these things come together. And I'm sure listeners are kind of getting a sense of that. You have to feel like there's a higher hand at work in some of this. And from Deb writing that story, Robert submitted it to the IANS, the Association for Near-Death Experiences. They loved it. They recorded it as one of their podcasts. Deb has now had an association with IANS. She has taught one of our programs there, More Than an Intro, the introduction to A Course in Miracles developed by James's wife, Mary Ann. So Deb is teaching A Course in Miracles to the NDE crowd, and then has also kind of gone on to have a relationship, a deeper relationship
She has
with
an
those folks.
ongoing
Yeah,
relationship with them.
and then Deb has, through Deb, Robert will be speaking to IANS. And so these stories just, they take on a life of their own. It's inspiring to see. They do touch lives. And so we're just so grateful for the way in which the Story Project has come to life. It would not have come to life at all if it weren't for your efforts, Sue, and for you as well, James. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing to share these stories with the world.
Can I just do a quick shout out to Nancy Picard? She is no longer with the Story Project, but there was like about 10 years before we started where I had guidance that she was supposed to be sharing stories with the story, there was no Story Project. And then when we finally started, she and Sue were a team, and she contributed. She's a great writer. She's a professional mystery novel writer. And so they were a team for a while. She submitted some great stories of her own. And unfortunately, she decided to get back in I'm saying unfortunately for us, she decided to get back in the business of writing mystery novels. And apparently when she writes a novel, she is absolutely consumed. So she had to bow out, but I do feel like the account of the Story Project wouldn't be complete without Nancy.
No.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Nancy's a wonderful writer and has become a friend of mine during this whole process of the Story Project coming together. And just by the way, if you're perusing our site, Deborah Kaiser's story is called A Gift of Grace, and it's just an incredibly lovely story to read. So read that one.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that too. So I'm sure there's two people who are searching like, what was Deb's story called? And thank you also for mentioning Nancy, Robert. You're right. An account of the Story Project would be incomplete without her. Thank you once again to you, Sue, and you, James, for all the work that you're putting into the Story Project.
Well, the thanks is mine to you all for providing this opportunity. I'm very honored to be in your company, but also in the company of all these other wonderful authors who have come forward.
And I'd just like to point out that, Jesus was a storyteller too. And I'm sure that in when he gave talks that people might not remember everything he said, but they'd remember all his stories.
Yeah, there's some truth to that.
Yeah,
we
good
do
point.
remember those stories.
Yeah. Stories have the power to change lives.
Yeah, look at what he did with his. Thanks so much to you both.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.